This is a 2007 Ferrari 599 GTB Fiorano, and it is an amazing car. 6-liter V12 shared with the Ferrari Enzo. Massive power, beautiful styling, incredibly rare, and this one is extra special because it has a 6-speed manual transmission. Nearly all 599 models were built with an automatic, including this one, but it's been converted to have 3 pedals and a gated 6-speed manual. And today I'm going to review it and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news, this 599 GTB is currently for sale, being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. Not only does this 599 have a 6-speed manual conversion, but it only has around 1,300 miles on it, which makes this incredibly special and incredibly rare, and you can buy it on Cars and Bids. So, once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to head over to the live auction for this 599 where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, the 599 GTB. And by the way, I should mention that the seller of this car on Cars and Bids has created their own great walk-around video showing it off inside and out. If you want more details, you can check that out. I'll link it in the description below. But for now, let's get to the quirks and features of this car, starting with a little overview of exactly what the 599 is. So, for years, Ferrari made 2 types of general production V12 cars. There was the 2-seater, which was sportier and more aggressive, and there was the V12 4-seater that was more of a grand touring luxury car. The 599 was the V12 2-seater, the sporty, aggressive performance one, and it came out in about 2007, 2008, and it replaced the Ferrari 550 and the Ferrari 575, which had been hugely popular before this car. Now, one of the really cool things about the 599 is it shared its powertrain with the Enzo. Basically, the same 6-liter V12 that the Enzo Supercar had was also stuffed into the 599. Now, of course, this engine was detuned a bit for this car. Ferrari couldn't have this be making the same amount of power as the mighty Enzo, so while the Enzo had 650 horsepower and 485 pound-feet of torque from its version of this V12, the 599 has 610 horsepower and 450 pound-feet. Still amazing numbers, brutally fast, great performance, but not quite on the level of the Enzo, even though it shares the same engine. But as cool as this car is on a general level, V12 Ferrari shares the Enzo's powertrain, the coolest part of this specific car is right here, the 6-speed gated manual transmission. You see, the Ferrari 550 that came before this was only offered with a manual transmission. That was replaced by the 575, and most of those had an automatic transmission, but you could still get a manual, and there's a fair bit of them out there. But when the 599 came out, well, it was pretty much only available with an automatic. Supposedly, Ferrari built 3,500 regular production units of the 599 GTB, and only 30 of them, 30, had a manual transmission. Apparently, 10 came to the United States, and 20 went to other markets, and that was it. Now, Ferrari also built a convertible model called the 599 SA Aperta, and a high-performance version called the 599 GTO. Those were automatic only. And so a total production run of maybe 4,200 units of the 599, only 30 of these came with a 6-speed manual transmission. Now, as you can imagine, that makes the 6-speed manual versions of this car very desirable today because the manual transmission has seen a surge in enthusiast interest. And the result is that a regular production manual 599 can sell for around $1 million in today's market, whereas one of these with an automatic is a less than $200,000 car. The transmission increases the value 5-fold because it's so desirable and so rare. And thus you start to understand why someone might want to convert one of these to have a manual transmission. The factory-built manuals are tremendously expensive, and that's if you can even find one of the handful that they built. easier just to convert. And so this one was. It was converted by a company called the European Auto Group, or EAG, which is located in San Antonio, Texas, and they've become known for these automatic to manual Ferrari conversions. EAG primarily converts 430s, F430s, and a few 430 Scuderias apparently, but the 599 is a whole different beast to convert. One of the main issues is that these cars were so rare that finding the parts necessary to make a manual transmission conversion is actually legitimately difficult, because Ferrari simply didn't make that many of the parts. It's just not really all that available. As a result, 599 manual conversions are going to be a lot harder to come by than 430 manual conversions, so this is a very special car. And even if you do find the parts, the conversion cost is going to be pretty high. This is the receipt from EAG to convert this car to a manual. The total cost was a whopping $85,000. That doesn't include the price of the car. That's just to switch this from an automatic to a 6-speed manual. But if you really long for that old school gated manual driving experience, it's the way to go. And it's still a lot cheaper than finding a factory built one. Now, as for this manual conversion and how it was executed, I gotta say, it looks tremendously well done. You can see in the center console, the gate, the shift lever, it all looks factory. Frankly, it doesn't look like this car has been upgraded or modified at all. It could really fool just about anybody. The only spot where you can see that it was originally a car with paddle shifters is on the steering column, where there's these little openings where paddle shifters could have gone when this car was originally an automatic. Of course, those were removed. They're not needed anymore for the manual, and so there are little holes left. But other than that, this looks like a factory-built 6-speed, and it gives you a 6-speed gated manual to drive a V12, which is just so cool. Now, if you get a 599 without a manual transmission, you instead get Ferrari's F1 Superfast transmission, which was a sequential manual, meaning it had an automated clutch, and you could drive it like an automatic or shift gears with the paddles. I've driven 599s with the F1 Superfast, and it's actually pretty good. It shifts quicker than almost every other sequential manual transmission, and it's not quite as clunky as those, but it's still not the same as driving a V12 car with 3 pedals and a gated shifter. But anyway, moving on from a general overview and the discussion of the manual conversion, let's talk about the rest of the quirks and features of this car, starting with the fact that when you climb inside, it is gorgeous in here. The seats are these beautiful leather Daytona style seats with these black bands going through the center. Absolutely fantastic, looks incredible. Carbon backed, they are gorgeous seats. And in fact, you see leather and carbon fiber basically everywhere you look in here. The dashboard, carbon fiber and leather. The center console, same deal, leather, carbon fiber, looks absolutely beautiful. The door panels, also tons of carbon fiber and leather. It is a gorgeous car with a beautiful high quality interior. And just behind the seats, like I mentioned, this car is only a 2-seater, so in back it has what they call a parcel shelf that is also full leather stitched with these gorgeous leather straps that will keep your suitcase in place should you want to put it there on a longer drive. Leather, carbon fiber, hand stitching everywhere you look, beautiful interior. And in fact, that's true even beyond the carbon fiber and the leather. All of the materials in this interior are top quality everywhere you look. They didn't cheap out on anything. One great example of that is the door sill, where you can see an actual Ferrari badge raised up. Looks like the thing they'd stick on the outside of the car. Most brands put like a flat badge here because it's constantly going to be kicked with shoes, but Ferrari went the classy route and made it look good. A little piece of attention to detail that just adds to the beauty. But anyway, moving inside the car for other quirks and features, in the center control stack you have the climate controls, which is a complicated mass of arrows and dials and buttons and switches, and it looks like about 3 controls too many. It's a little excessive and ridiculous, but that was the climate controls Ferrari used in this era. Now, directly above that, you have this carbon fiber panel with 2 flags, Ferrari and Pininfarina. Ferrari, the builder of this car, Pininfarina, the designer, which is kind of funny because soon after this car, Ferrari and Pininfarina parted ways. Ferrari stopped using them and they started designing the cars themselves, and so these cross flags are kind of a memento of a sadly bygone era. But anyway, the flags are mounted on this panel. If you push on the panel, it pops up and reveals the radio in this car, which is interestingly hidden behind this panel. So you can listen to the radio if you want, or if you're just sick of it, you can close the panel and you don't even have to look at that radio. Next up, other interesting controls in this car. Maybe the most unusual is in the center console, you have this giant panel for 2 buttons, lock and unlock. They're quite far apart and they're given a surprisingly large amount of room, but they're there, the lock and unlock buttons for the doors. Also in this vicinity, you have a button marked open, which you might think is the trunk or maybe a door. It's actually the glove box. You press that and the glove box falls open. No traditional glove box latch, because that would have taken away from the leather stitched beauty. And by the way, speaking of the glove box open, you can see even the owner's manual pouch is a gorgeous leather stitched affair that matches the stitching and interior color of this car, adding to the beauty and quality of everything, even the owner's manual inside the glove box. But anyway, speaking of controls to open stuff inside this car, the trunk release is down at the floor in the driver's foot area. You press this and then the trunk pops open and you can see the fuel door release is also in that area. Press that and then the fuel door opens up. As for other interesting controls, this car has automatic headlights. You can see the headlight dial here. You can switch it to auto, which was pretty advanced for Ferrari. They didn't do a lot of driver aid stuff. They still don't. So having automatic headlights was a nice luxury feature. And it wasn't the only luxury this car introduced into the Ferrari world. Another big one is the screen in the gauge cluster. You can see off to the left, you have a full color screen. It doesn't really display that much information and it's not configurable at all, but it was a start, the beginning of screens in Ferraris, which of course have now proliferated just like every other car. And Ferrari has a lot of technology in screens. It basically started here with the 599 and its gauge cluster screen instead of a traditional analog cluster. Now, with that said, you can see in the gauge cluster, it still looks pretty old school Ferrari with a bright yellow tachometer in the center. Not the speedometer, because these cars were for the racetrack and you didn't care how fast you were going on the track, just what your engine speed was. So the tachometer is front and center and the speedometer is pushed off to the side and de-emphasized, which is a Ferrari and general sports car hallmark. Now, one interesting thing you'll notice to the right of the gauge cluster, you have 2 unlabeled black buttons. These buttons control like the trip odometer, resetting it, and also setting the clock, but that's what they're there for if you're curious. Now, speaking of buttons in this vicinity, another interesting one is the steering wheel. This car has an engine start button on the steering wheel, you can see, but this car also comes from that era where you didn't have proximity keys, so you can't just get in and press start. You first have to put the key in the ignition hole, twist it like a normal car, and then you can press the start button, which kind of defeats the purpose of having a start button, but that was the way that it worked. Now, the other control on the steering wheel is this little switch here, which allows you to choose the drive mode that you're in. It goes all the way from like wet to slippery to sport to race, and there's even one extra mode that turns off traction control entirely if you really know what you're doing. That's your drive mode switch. Other than that, no real controls on the steering wheel. Later Ferrari models added a lot of controls to the wheel, your turn signals, your wipers, your high beams. In this car, those are still on stalks coming off the steering column. It was kind of the last car Ferrari made before transitioning to full controls on the wheel. And next we move under the hood in the 599 GTB, where there is a lot to say. Although, first a little anecdote, I went to open the hood latch, which is in the driver's footwell like every car, and I see the 3 pedals there, and I do like a double take. Like, that doesn't make any sense. Even though I know I'm shooting a video on a manual 599, it just doesn't compute in my mind that this car would have 3 pedals. But you can see that too is done well, looks factory with the addition of a clutch pedal, and it just adds to the coolness factor of this car. But anyway, open up the hood and you can see the engine. And probably the most notable thing under here is just how far back the engine is. It really doesn't take up most of this engine bay. It's pushed all the way to the back so that it can be more centered in the car. It's basically behind the front wheels, which greatly helps with weight distribution and keeps this kind of a mid-engine car. Instead of having a big heavy engine hang over the front of the car, it's in the middle for better balance. And as for the engine itself, absolutely beautiful. Like I said, 6-liter V12 shared with the Enzo, but just look at it. The red on top, you can clearly see all 12 cylinders. It just looks awesome. An incredibly cool engine in this car, adding to the exoticness as if this car wasn't already exotic enough. I also like the fact that in the engine bay you have a little plaque that gives the chassis number of this car. For those of you who don't know, Ferrari basically started numbering their chassis with 1 back in the late 1940s, and they've counted up ever since. So you know exactly where your Ferrari fits in the history of Ferrari chassis numbers, and that's always kind of a cool thing to see. And there it is at the front of the 599 engine bay. Now, next up, speaking of openings in this car, let's talk about the trunk. And yes, this car does have a traditional trunk opening, as you can see. Despite the sloping rear roofline, this is not a hatchback like some Ferraris, including the F12 and the 812 that came after this. Instead, this has a traditional trunk. Nothing particularly interesting in the trunk, as you can see, fairly standard, although if you lift up the floor of the trunk, you have this Ferrari box, and inside this box is a toolkit. You have a tire inflator here, which can be useful, and then some other tools which are not as useful, like a screwdriver and some bulbs, as if a 599 owner is ever going to be changing stuff on the roadside using their toolkit. But it's a historical Ferrari thing. They've always come with toolkits, and so this does too. But more importantly, around the back of the 599 than the trunk are some gorgeous design elements that I've always felt really give this car a distinctive and beautiful look. One is the base of the rear window, which you can see is curved at the bottom, makes like a half circle shape at the top of the trunk lid base of the rear window. Most cars' rear windows just meet the trunk line in a flat horizontal line, but this with the curve just looks so much more beautiful and distinctive. I love it. And then there's the flying buttresses. Take a look next to the rear window and you can see these panels that come out from the body of the car, and there's a hole between these panels and the window. There's like a space where air can pass through here. These were called flying buttresses, and they were a totally alien concept when this car came out, although since then a few other cars have adopted this design. The way it works is air passes through these flying buttresses and provides enough downforce on this car that it doesn't need a rear wing. Instead, the buttresses act as a rear wing, and they can generate that downforce as an air channel. Now, I always felt that this was an especially clever piece of design because a rear wing would ruin the look of this car. These V12 Ferraris were supposed to be subtle, understated, classy, in comparison to the racy sports car look of the mid-engine V8 models like the F430 and the 458. This car was supposed to be elegant, and putting a rear wing on it would have screwed that up. The solution to do the flying buttresses instead was a stroke of design genius that preserved the classy look but still gave this car the downforce that it needed. And in fact, in terms of the classy look of this car, I gotta say, it is beautiful. The 599 didn't have the most showy, overstated, aggressive design, but it was a gorgeous car. Again, elegant, understated, classy, just like you'd want from a V12 Ferrari. I especially always loved this line on the side, from the vent all the way back. The upper line becomes the window line down the side of the car, and the lower one fades into the door. A thing of beauty, this car. Not overstated, not too many scoops and hoops and vents, just a beautiful, elegant, classy look. And indeed, the design of this car being so beautiful and so understated is a great example of Pininfarina's genius. So many of the most beautiful Ferrari models were designed by Pininfarina, and this car is a good example of why it's such a shame that Pininfarina doesn't design Ferrari models anymore. Frankly, in my opinion, they still should, and this car is proof. But worth pointing out that despite its beautiful, classy, elegant, luxury looks, this car still sounds mean when you rev the engine. Take a listen to this V12. All right, this is so cool. I'm driving a stick 599. Not only is it cool to be driving a stick 599, of which none exist, but it's just cool to be driving a stick V12. To drive a V12 and do it yourself. How cool is that? So first impressions, just starting to drive this car, just like all gated manual Ferrari shifters, the shifter feels so good. It is perfectly weighted. The seller of this car told me that the owner went to significant trouble in order to find shift rods instead of shift cables, like the actual 599 manual has shift rods, not cables, in order to perfectly replicate the experience of the factory car. Even though they could have done cables and it would have been easier, they found the rods, and that gives gives this car like a perfect factory feel. And I love the way gated Ferrari manuals feel. It not just looks cool and it not just sounds cool when you like clink into gear, but it also feels. That's the cool thing about gated Ferrari. They feel great, especially more modern ones. Kind of like 360 and on Ferrari manuals just feel so good. Perfectly weighted to shift. It slots into each gate so nicely and so easily, and it is such a shame that right as Ferrari honestly perfected the manual transmission, they got out of the whole game. Now, contrary to the perfect ease of using the shift lever in this car, the clutch pedal is surprisingly heavy. Now, they used all factory parts to make this car, so I guess the regular stick 599 clutch is pretty heavy, but I'm surprised how heavy it is. Now, I gotta tell you, this is just the coolest feeling in the world. I am a huge 599 fan. I think that the general 599 is an unbelievable bargain in today's market. You can pick up a high mileage 599 for like 120 with an automatic, and it is so much car for that money. So I already love this car, and when I see them on the road, I get so excited. They were a special car. But then I drive this with the stick, and it is so cool. I'm driving a V12 Ferrari and doing all the gear changing myself. Like, how cool is this? Now, interestingly, the manual transmission really does change the character of this car. I like the 599 a lot, like I just said, but it is clunky. Like, the automatic is a clunky piece of kit. Like, you shift, you kind of wait a second, even though it's the best F1 automatic there ever was, even with all the other brands, SMG, SMT, all that. Ferrari's super fast was the very best one, F1 super fast. But it's still kind of clunky. Oh. This is so cool. Oh, I love this so much. It is not often that I get a shift 12 cylinders. Like, that is so cool. It is just so cool to be able to rev match a V12. It's so rare. I mean, I'm trying to think of other V12 manuals I drove. F50 is one, the 850 CSI. They're just so rare. And a gated manual, like it's so cool. It feels so cool. This car is absolutely one of the greats. It is awesome. Oh, and like all 599s, just totally glued to the road. The other thing about this car that nobody talks about, because oftentimes the conversation about 599 is transmission related. Oh, they made sticks, or oh, the auto isn't as good. But the thing that nobody talks about this car is it drives so damn well. The V12 is unbelievably fast. The steering is incredible. This car on rails, that's what people always say. This car feels like that. Like, it is so precise and so quick to change gear. There's no body roll. It is incredibly predictable. But back to the transmission for a sec, driving it around, it is interesting. It really does change the character of this car. To have this car with a manual transmission and feel that and drive it that way, it's totally different. It's a totally different experience. The way that they pulled the engine back to make this car mid-engine, the balance is fantastic. It does not feel like a Viper or an SLR with an enormous amount of weight sitting out over the front. The car is just perfectly poised and designed. And I just love driving these cars. And yeah, it sucks that it's a conversion. It'd be way cooler to have a factory manual. But I mean, go find one. I looked to see what they cost, and one hasn't sold for like 3 years. So the market has gone crazy since then. Who knows what they're worth now? Because they never transact. But here's one, conversion, but if you want the driving experience more than anything, this is the way to go. You can actually use it without worrying about $1 million car, and it's just as fun, and it is so much fun. And so that's a 2007 Ferrari 599 GTB with a 6-speed manual transmission. That is a truly incredible car. Finding an original manual 599 GTB would be cool, but Ferrari only made a couple dozen of them, and when they do come up for sale, they're now $1 million cars. Here's your chance to have the same experience for a lot less money, and you can get it on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give this 599 a Doug score. And the DOUGSCORE is here, 64 out of 100, which places this manual 599 here against some similar cars. The score is no surprise, really, as it ends up near all the other exotics of its day, the Ferrari F430, the Aston Vanquish, the Lamborghini Murcielago, and even the Lexus LFA, which has pretty similar performance. I love the 599, and automatic models are amazing bargains, but the manual adds a really cool new energy to the whole thing, rowing your own gears in a modern V12 Ferrari. It's an amazing experience, and it's a bargain compared to finding one of the few factory-built cars that exist.